My name is Sarah Jenkins. They say the most dangerous person in the room is the one who was told they'd never amount to anything. For 24 years, that was the only thing my father ever said to me. He didn't say it with a raised voice. He said it with a chilling, calculated disappointment that cuts deeper than any scream ever could. He told me I was a failure, a mistake, a ghost in his high-achieving world. He left me with nothing but a suitcase and a burning need to prove him wrong. But life has a funny way of balancing the scales. 3 weeks ago, my father called me for the first time in 5 years. He didn't call to apologize. He called to brag. He wanted me to know he'd finally found someone worthy of his name, a woman who was everything I wasn't. He told me she was a high-level executive at one of the top firms in the city. He invited me to dinner just so I could see what real success looked like. What he didn't realize, what he couldn't possibly have known, is that I'm the one who signs her paychecks. The drive to my childhood home in the suburbs of Chicago felt like a descent into a past I'd spent a decade trying to bury. Every manicured lawn and white picket fence reminded me of the suffocating expectations I could never meet. My father, Richard, was a man who measured worth in net value and social standing. If you weren't an asset, you were a liability. And in his eyes, I was the biggest liability he ever owned. I pulled my Audi into the driveway, the gravel crunching under the tires. I took a deep breath, adjusting the sleeves of my blazer. I wasn't that scared girl anymore. I wasn't the daughter who cried because her B+ wasn't an A. I was the CEO of Jenkins and Associates, a firm I built from the dirt up without a single cent of his inheritance. I stepped out, the cool Illinois air hitting my face, and walked toward the door. Richard opened the door before I could even knock. He looked exactly the same, sharp suit, silver hair, and that predatory glimmer in his eyes that looked for a weakness before it looked for a greeting. He didn't hug me. He didn't even smile. He just stepped aside and gestured toward the living room. "You're late, Sarah," he said, checking his watch. "Some things never change, I suppose. Lack of discipline is a hard habit to break." I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just walked past him, my heels clicking on the hardwood floors. "Traffic was heavy, Richard. It's good to see you, too." He followed me into the living room where a woman was standing by the fireplace. She was younger than him, much younger, probably in her late 30s. She was dressed in a sleek navy blue power suit, her hair pulled back into a tight, professional bun. She looked like the embodiment of corporate ambition. "Sarah, I'd like you to meet Monica," Richard said, his voice dripping with a pride he'd never once used for me. "Monica is the senior director of operations at a major firm downtown. She's been instrumental in their recent merger. She's what I always hoped you would become: focused, driven, and indispensable." Monica turned around, a polite, practiced smile on her face. But the moment our eyes met, the smile didn't just fade, it evaporated. Her face went pale, a ghostly shade of white that stood out against the warm lighting of the room. She froze, her hand gripping her wine glass so tightly I thought it might shatter. "Sarah," she whispered, her voice trembling. Richard looked between us, a frown forming on his face. "You two know each other?" I took a slow sip of the water Richard had begrudgingly handed me. I let the silence hang in the air for a long, agonizing moment. I wanted him to feel the shift in the room. I wanted him to feel the foundation of his pride start to crack. "Know her," I said, my voice calm and steady. "Monica is one of my most dedicated employees, Richard. In fact, she's been up for a promotion in my firm for the last 3 months." The silence that followed was heavy. Richard's face went through a visible transformation, from confusion to denial, and finally to a dull, throbbing shock. He looked at Monica, waiting for her to laugh, waiting for her to tell him I was lying. But Monica couldn't even look at him. She was staring at the floor, her shoulders slumped. "Your firm," Richard stammered. "Sarah, what are you talking about? Monica works for Jenkins and Associates. They're the top consulting group in the Midwest." "I know," I replied, leaning back against the sofa. "I'm the Jenkins in Jenkins and Associates. I founded it 4 years ago. Didn't you see the Forbes feature last month? Oh, that's right, you stopped keeping track of my failures the day you kicked me out." Richard sank into his armchair, the air seemingly leaving his lungs. This man, who had spent my entire life making me feel small, suddenly looked tiny. He looked at the woman he'd put on a pedestal just to spite me and realized she was beholden to the daughter he'd discarded. "Monica," Richard said, his voice cracking. "Is this true? Is she your boss?" Monica finally looked up, her eyes brimming with a mixture of professional fear and personal embarrassment. "She's the owner, Richard. Sarah is the CEO. I didn't know you were her father. You always spoke about your daughter as if she was, well, as if she didn't have a career." I watched the realization sink in. He had invited me here to humiliate me, to show me the life I failed to achieve, only to realize that he was living in a world I now controlled. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had flipped entirely. "So," I said, setting my glass down on the mahogany coffee table, "shall we talk about that promotion, Monica? Or should we talk about why my father thinks you're the only successful woman in this room?" The tension was so thick you could feel it in your teeth. Richard was staring at me as if he were seeing a stranger. And in a way, he was. He had never bothered to know the woman I had become. He was too busy mourning the failure he thought I was. "I think," Richard began, his voice barely a whisper, "there's been a misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding, Richard." I cut him off, my voice sharp and cold. "You spent 20 years telling me I wouldn't survive without you. You spent 20 years making sure I knew I was nothing. And yet, here we are, in your house, eating your food while the woman you love relies on me to pay her mortgage. Tell me, who's the failure now?" Monica looked like she wanted the earth to swallow her whole. She knew how I ran my company. She knew I didn't tolerate ego, and she knew that her relationship with my father was now a massive professional liability. She was caught between the man she was dating and the woman who held her future in her hands. But this was just the beginning. The dinner hadn't even started, and already the skeletons were crawling out of the closet. Richard wasn't just hiding his disdain for me, he was hiding the real reason he'd reached out after all these years. And as I looked at Monica's nervous fidgeting, I realized she wasn't just a trophy girlfriend. She was a pawn in a much larger, much dirtier game Richard was trying to play. I stood up, smoothing out my blazer. "You know what? I've lost my appetite for dinner, but I think I'll stay for the conversation. I want to hear exactly what you wanted from me tonight, Richard, because we both know you didn't invite me here just to meet Monica." Richard looked up at me, the arrogance finally stripped away, replaced by a desperate, hungry look. He was in trouble, financial trouble, and he thought his successful daughter, the one he'd finally acknowledged only when he needed something, might be his golden ticket. "Sarah, please," he said, his voice losing its edge. "Sit down. Let's talk like adults." I sat, but I didn't sit as his daughter. I sat as the CEO of the company that owned his girlfriend's career, and quite possibly the only person who could save him from the ruin he had brought upon himself. Richard didn't just look defeated, he looked fragile. The silence that stretched between us was no longer the oppressive quiet of my childhood. It was the sound of a man realizing he had no cards left to play. He glanced at Monica, who was staring at her lap as if the patterns on the rug held the secrets to saving her job. "I'm in a bind, Sarah," Richard finally admitted, his voice lacking its usual resonance. "The firm I've been consulting for, they've been hit with a massive restructuring. My contracts were terminated last month. I've put everything I had into a new venture, but the capital dried up faster than I anticipated." I leaned back, crossing my legs. I felt a cold, analytical detachment. "And let me guess, you saw the headlines about Jenkins and Associates. You realized your failure of a daughter was sitting on the kind of liquidity you desperately need. So you decided to play the family card you threw away years ago. It's not just about the money," he lied, though even he didn't seem to believe it. "I wanted to bridge the gap, Monica and I. We've been talking about the future." She spoke so highly of her CEO, about how brilliant and cutthroat she was. I had no idea she was talking about you until tonight. I turned my gaze to Monica. "Is that true, Monica?" "You didn't know?" Monica looked up, her eyes wide. I swear, Sarah, Richard always referred to you as the estranged one. He never used your last name when he talked about your childhood. I thought he was talking about a daughter who was struggling. I had no idea he was the same Richard who was featured in your do not hire advisory list for independent consultants. The air in the room shifted again. Richard's head snapped toward Monica. Do not hire list? What are you talking about? I let out a short, dry laugh. Oh, Richard, you really didn't think I did my homework? When I started my firm, I made a list of every predatory consultant in the tri-state area. Men who prioritize their commission over the client's stability. Your name was at the top. I've spent years ensuring that none of my partners or subsidiaries ever let you near their books. You haven't just been struggling because of restructuring. You've been blacklisted by the very industry I now lead. Richard's face went from pale to a deep, bruised purple. The humiliation was complete. Not only was his daughter his girlfriend's boss, but she was also the architect of his professional demise. He had spent his life trying to gatekeep success, only to find that I had built a wall around him. You did this on purpose, he hissed, the old venom returning to his voice. You spend your energy sabotaging your own father. Do you have any idea how spiteful that is? It's not spite, Richard. It's business, I replied, my voice as level as a horizon. You taught me that, remember? In business, there are winners and there are lessons. You were my first lesson. I learned exactly who not to trust, how not to treat people, and how to spot a fraud from a mile away. I didn't blacklist you because you're my father. I blacklisted you because you're bad for business. Monica shifted uncomfortably. Sarah, I had no idea about any of this. Our relationship is professional, Monica, I interrupted, my tone softening just enough to let her know she wasn't the target yet. But you're a senior director. You're supposed to have a keen eye for character. The fact that you're dating a man who actively tried to dismantle the reputation of the company you work for, that's a conflict of interest we're going to have to discuss in the office on Monday. Monica's face crumbled. She knew she was caught in the crossfire of a decades-long war she didn't understand. She looked at Richard, and for the first time I saw her see him for what he really was, an anchor dragging her down. I think I should go, Monica whispered, reaching for her purse. No, stay, Richard pleaded, his desperation finally breaking through. Monica, don't. Sarah is just being dramatic. She's trying to punish me. Punish you? I stood up, the movement slow and deliberate. Richard, you've punished yourself. You've lived your life believing that people are only worth what you can get out of them. And now you have nothing left to offer. Your house is leveraged, your reputation is in tatters, and the only reason you have a roof over your head is likely because Monica has been helping with the mortgage. The silence that followed was the confirmation I needed. Monica's quick intake of breath told me everything. She had been bankrolling his venture. Is that where your salary is going, Monica? I asked, looking her in the eye. Are you funding the same man who told me I was a failure while he was failing himself? Are you using the bonuses I gave you for your hard work to prop up his ego? Monica didn't answer. She didn't have to. She stood up, her professional mask completely shattered. I'm leaving, Richard. Don't call me? She didn't look back. She walked out of the house, the front door slamming shut with a finality that echoed through the empty hallway. Richard stood there frozen, watching his last lifeline walk out the door. He turned back to me, his eyes filled with a raw, ugly hatred. You destroyed everything, he spat. You came into my home and took my dignity, my relationship, my future. You're a monster, Sarah. No, Richard, I said, walking toward the door. I'm your daughter. I'm exactly what you made me. You wanted me to be driven, didn't you? You wanted me to be ruthless? Well, here I am. You should be proud. You finally got exactly what you asked for. I reached the door and paused, looking back at the man who had loomed like a giant over my childhood. He looked so small now, standing in the middle of a house that felt more like a tomb than a home. By the way, I added, my hand on the doorknob. I checked the foreclosure filings before I came over. You have 30 days before the bank takes this place. Since Monica is no longer in the picture to cover your shortfalls, I'd suggest you start packing. But don't worry, I'm not a monster. I know a few shelters downtown that take in people who have nowhere else to go. I'll have my assistant send you the addresses." I walked out into the cool night air, the sound of my heels on the gravel feeling like a victory march. I got into my car and sat there for a moment, the engine idling. I expected to feel guilty. I expected to feel some shred of the old pain, but there was nothing, just a clean, sharp sense of closure. The failure had won, not by lowering herself to his level, but by rising so far above it that he couldn't even reach my shadow. As I drove away from the house I once feared, I saw Richard standing in the window, a silhouette of a man who had spent his life building a throne of lies, only to realize he was sitting in the dark, all alone. Monday morning at Jenkins and Associates didn't feel like a victory lap. It felt like a reckoning. The glass walls of our downtown Chicago headquarters usually offered a sense of transparency and light, but today they felt like a cage for anyone with a secret. I walked through the lobby, the staff offering their usual nods of respect, but I could feel the tension radiating from the executive wing. News travels fast in a high-stakes environment, even if the news hasn't been spoken aloud yet. I sat at my desk, the mahogany surface polished to a mirror shine, and looked at the calendar. 9 a.m., Monica Thorne. There was a soft knock. Monica didn't wait for me to answer before she stepped in. She looked like she hadn't slept. The navy blue power suit from Friday had been replaced by a charcoal gray dress, but the armor was cracked. She sat down across from me without being asked, her hands trembling slightly as she placed a leather folder on my desk. "My resignation," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't touch the folder, I didn't even look at it. I kept my eyes fixed on her. "Why, Monica, you're one of the most capable directors I have. Your performance metrics are in the top 5% of the company. Why would you throw that away because of a man who isn't worth your time?" "Because I lied to you," she snapped, a flash of her old fire returning. "Not directly, maybe, but by omission. I've been with Richard for 18 months. I knew he was struggling, but I believed his stories. He told me he was a victim of corporate ageism. He told me his daughter was a drug addict who stole from him. I felt sorry for him, Sarah. I thought I was being the strong woman behind a great man who just needed a break." I leaned forward, my elbows on the desk. "He's a manipulator, Monica. He spent 60 years perfecting the art of making his failures someone else's fault. But that's not why you're resigning. You're resigning because you're embarrassed. You're embarrassed that the woman you look up to professionally is the same addict daughter he disparaged." "It's more than that," she said, a tear finally escaping. "I used my insider knowledge to help him. Not with client data, I'd never do that, but I helped him refine his pitches. I gave him the language he needed to sound like he was still relevant. I inadvertently helped him stay on his feet long enough to keep trying to sabotage you. I can't stay here knowing that." I took a deep breath, looking out at the city skyline. This was the realism of the situation. There were no clean breaks in the real world. My victory over my father had collateral damage, and Monica was it. "I'm not accepting your resignation," I said, finally looking at her. "Not yet, but you are being demoted. You'll move back to junior director of operations. Your salary will be cut by 30% for the next 6 months, and you will undergo a full internal audit to ensure no proprietary information was shared. If you pass that, and if you prove your loyalty is to this firm and not to your romantic interests, we'll talk about your future." Monica stared at me, stunned. "You're keeping me after what happened?" "I don't fire people for being human, Monica. I fire them for being incompetent. You're not incompetent, you were just compromised. Now get out of my office and get to work. And if I hear that you've had so much as a phone call with Richard Jenkins, you won't just be fired. I'll make sure you're as blacklisted as he is." She nodded frantically, grabbed her folder, and practically ran out of the room. But Richard wasn't done. He was like a cornered animal, dangerous not because he was strong, but because he was desperate. 2 hours later, my assistant buzzed me. "Sarah, your father is in the lobby. He doesn't have an appointment and he's making a scene. Security is on standby." I felt a weary weight settle in my chest. "Send him up, and tell security to wait outside my door." Richard didn't walk into my office. He stormed in. He wasn't wearing a suit today. He was wearing a weathered trench coat and a sweater that looked like it hadn't been washed in days. The mask of the successful patriarch had completely dissolved, leaving behind a bitter, aging man who realized the world had moved on without him. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" he shouted, slamming his hands onto my desk. "You think you can just buy people's loyalty? You turned Monica against me. She changed the locks, Sarah. She threw my clothes onto the driveway like I was some kind of criminal." "You are a criminal in spirit, Richard," I said, not moving an inch. "You've spent your life stealing the confidence of everyone around you to build your own ego. Monica finally saw the ledger and she realized you were in the red." "I need $50,000, he said, his voice dropping from a shout to a pathetic, ragged plea. "Just 50,000 to get the bank off my back. To get a new place. I'm your father, Sarah. You wouldn't be here without me. You wouldn't have that drive, that ruthlessness you're so proud of if I hadn't pushed you." "You didn't push me, Richard. You tried to crush me. I didn't succeed because of you. I succeeded in spite of you. There's a massive difference. And as for the money, no, not a dime." He looked at me, and for a second I saw a flicker of the man I used to fear. The man who could make me feel like I was 5 years old and worthless with just a glance. But the spell was broken. "I'll go to the press," he threatened, his eyes narrowing. "CEO of Jenkins and Associates lets her own father starve on the streets." Imagine the headlines. Imagine what that does to your stock price, your reputation. I actually smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. "Go ahead, please. I'll give you the numbers for the Chicago Tribune and the Wall Street Journal. Because when they look into the story, they'll find the records of your failed businesses. They'll find the do not hire lists. They'll find the testimony from Monica about how you used her. And then they'll write a story about a self-made woman who had the courage to cut out a toxic, parasitic shadow from her life. In today's world, Richard, that's not a scandal, that's an inspiration." He slumped. The threat was his last bullet, and it had been a blank. He looked around the office, the expensive art, the high-end technology, the sheer scale of my success, and he finally realized that he was a ghost in my world. "I have nothing," he whispered. "You have exactly what you gave me when I was 18, I reminded him. "You have your health, your wits, and a suitcase. You told me then that a real winner starts from zero." "Well, Richard, welcome to zero. I suggest you start winning." I pressed the button on my intercom. "Security, please escort Mr. Jenkins out. He's finished here." As they led him away, he didn't fight. He didn't scream. He just walked with his head down, a broken man being removed from a building that bore his name but none of his legacy. I sat back in my chair, the silence of the office rushing back in. But the drama wasn't over. As I looked at my computer screen, an alert popped up. It was an email from my private investigator. Subject: Richard's new venture, internal findings. I opened it and my blood ran cold. Richard hadn't just been losing money. He had been involved in something much darker, something that involved my company's upcoming merger. He wasn't just a failing consultant, he was a mole. And the person he was working for wasn't a stranger. The email was a collection of scanned documents, wire transfer records, and encrypted chat logs. As I scrolled, the air in the room felt thin. Richard hadn't just been a pathetic man looking for a handout, he had been a Trojan horse. He was working for Marcus Thorne, Monica's ex-husband, and the CEO of our primary competitor, Thorne Capital. The new venture Richard kept mentioning? It was a shell company designed to funnel proprietary data from Jenkins and Associates during our upcoming merger with the Sterling Group. Richard wasn't just dating Monica because he liked her, he was using her access to get to me. He wanted to bankrupt me not just to save himself, but to finally prove that I was the failure he always said I was. I closed my laptop and stared at the door where he had just been escorted out. The level of betrayal was staggering. He was willing to destroy my life's work, the very thing he claimed to be proud of in his twisted way, just to satisfy his ego. I called Monica back into my office. She looked even worse than before. "Sit down, Monica, and don't say a word until I'm finished," I said, my voice vibrating with a quiet fury. I turned the laptop screen toward her. Did you know Richard was in contact with your ex-husband? Her jaw dropped. Marcus? No, Sarah, I haven't spoken to Marcus since the divorce was finalized 2 years ago. He hates me. He hates anyone associated with me. He doesn't hate your access, I countered. Richard was feeding him information about our internal restructuring. Every time you refined a pitch for Richard or discussed your day at the office over dinner, he was taking notes and sending them to Thorn Capital. They were planning to short our stock the moment the Sterling merger was announced, using the instability Richard was helping to create. Monica collapsed into the chair, burying her face in her hands. I was his source. I was the one giving him the knife to stab you in the back. You were the tool, Monica. Richard was the hand, but Marcus Thorn is the brain. I stood up and began pacing the length of the floor-to-ceiling windows. They thought they were playing a game of checkers with a girl. They didn't realize I've been playing chess against a grandmaster, my father, since I was 6 years old. The realism of corporate warfare in America isn't about grand speeches. It's about documentation and leverage. I didn't call the police. Not yet. In this world, the law is slow, but the market is fast. If I went to the authorities now, the merger would freeze, our valuation would plummet, and Marcus would win anyway. I had to neutralize the threat from the inside. Here's what's going to happen, I said, stopping in front of Monica. You're going to call Richard. You're going to tell him you've changed your mind. You're going to tell him you're sorry for throwing him out and that you've realized you can't live without him. You're going to invite him to a celebratory dinner tonight at the Blackstone Hotel. Sarah, I can't look at him, she sobbed. I can't pretend. You will pretend because your career and your freedom depends on it, I snapped. If this data leak is traced back to you and you don't help me fix it, you'll be facing corporate espionage charges that will ensure you never work in this country again. Do I make myself clear? She wiped her eyes, her expression hardening. Clear. Good. At that dinner, you're going to accidentally leave your work tablet on the table while you go to the restroom. On that tablet will be a file labeled Sterling Merger Final Valuation. It will contain fake data, inflated numbers, and a hidden poison pill provision that will bankrupt anyone who tries to hostilely take over our shares. I spent the next 6 hours working with my IT security team to craft the perfect bait. We created a digital trail that looked authentic but led to a financial dead end. By 7 p.m., the trap was set. I watched from a black SUV parked across from the Blackstone Hotel. I saw Richard pull up in a taxi. The Audi he'd been driving was likely repossessed or hidden. He straightened his coat, that same old arrogant smirk returning to his face. He thought he was back in the game. He thought he had successfully manipulated Monica into giving him one last shot at the prize. Through the earpiece, I heard their conversation. Monica was performing better than I expected. She played the part of the desperate, lonely woman perfectly. I just felt so guilty, Richard, she said over the sound of clinking silverware. Sarah was so cold to you, it made me realize that I don't want to be like her. I want to be with someone who understands what it's like to build something. I knew you'd come around, babe, Richard's voice boomed through the receiver. Sarah is a fluke. She's got the title, but she doesn't have the vision. Once this new venture of mine takes off, we won't even need her name on the building. I felt a pang of disgust, but I pushed it down. Vision was his favorite word for scam. I watched on my monitor as Monica stood up. I'll be right back, I just need to freshen up. Oh, can you watch my tablet? I was working on the Sterling file before I came in and I don't want the servers to time out. Of course, honey. Take your time. The moment the bathroom door closed behind her, Richard didn't hesitate. He pulled a thumb drive from his pocket, a drive I knew was coded to Marcus Thorn's specifications, and plugged it into the tablet. I watched the progress bar on my screen. 10%, 40%, 90%, upload complete. He tucked the drive back into his pocket just as Monica returned. He was smiling, toasted her with a glass of expensive champagne he couldn't afford, and laughed. To the future, Monica, it's looking brighter than ever. I signaled my driver to pull away. I had everything I needed. The drive didn't just contain fake files. It contained a tracking worm that was currently embedding itself into Marcus Thorne's private server. Within minutes, I would have access to every communication between my father and my rival. But the real twist was yet to come. As the data started pouring into my laptop, I saw a folder labeled Trust Agreement Richard Jenkins. I opened it, expecting to see a payoff for his betrayal. Instead, I saw a life insurance policy. A massive one. Marcus Thorne wasn't planning on paying Richard. He was planning on disposing of him. The new venture was a setup to frame Richard for the entire leak, and once the police came knocking, Richard wouldn't be around to tell his side of the story. My father was so busy trying to destroy me that he hadn't realized he was being lined up for the slaughter by the very man he called an ally. I pulled out my phone and dialed Richard's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice smug. "Changed your mind about that 50,000, Sarah? Check your email, Richard," I said, my voice cold. "I just sent you a copy of the contract Marcus Thorne signed this morning. You might want to skip dessert. You're not the hunter in this scenario. You're the bait." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. For a man who always had a comeback, Richard Jenkins was finally speechless. I could almost hear the gears grinding in his head as he opened the attachment. The sound of his heavy, panicked breathing filled my ear. This can't be right," he stammered, his smugness replaced by a thin, wavering terror. "Marcus and I had a deal. I gave him everything, Sarah. I gave him the keys to your kingdom." "No, Richard, you gave him a rope and he's currently tying the noose around your neck," I said, watching from the shadows as he stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over his chair. "Marcus Thorne doesn't leave loose ends. The moment that thumb drive touches his server, a forensic trail is created that leads directly to your IP address. He's going to leak the sterling files, the stock will tank, and when the SEC looks for someone to blame, they'll find a desperate, bankrupt man who had every motive to burn his daughter's company down. You aren't his partner, you're his fall guy." "Sarah, help me," he whispered. It was the first time in my life he had ever used those words. "I'm your father, you can't let him do this." "I'm not letting him do anything," I replied, my voice hard as flint. "I'm letting you face the consequences of the bed you made. But because I'm a better person than you ever were, I'm giving you exactly 10 minutes. 10 minutes before my legal team sends the encrypted logs of your meetings with Marcus to the authorities. If I were you, I'd spend those 10 minutes running." I hung up. I didn't wait to see if he ran. I didn't care. The final phase of the plan was already in motion. While Richard was spiraling in a hotel lobby, my IT team was using the worm I'd planted on that thumb drive. We weren't just watching Marcus, we were dismantling him. The worm wasn't just a tracker, it was a mirror. It was currently duplicating Marcus's private ledger, his offshore accounts, and the proof of his attempted market manipulation. By 11 p.m., I was back in my office. The city lights of Chicago felt like a crown. Monica was sitting in the lobby, guarded by security, waiting for her fate. Marcus Thorne was likely celebrating a victory that was about to turn into a life sentence. And my father, he was a ghost in the wind. I hit send on a pre-drafted email to the board of directors at Thorne Capital. Attached were the records of Marcus's illegal activities. By tomorrow morning, the board would fire him to save their own skin. By tomorrow afternoon, the Sterling merger would go through at an even higher valuation because I had successfully neutralized the only threat to our stability. There was a soft knock on the door. It was Monica. She looked hollowed out. "He's gone," she said. He didn't even look at me. He just grabbed his coat and ran out of the hotel like the building was on fire. "I think I'm going to be sick, Sarah." "Go home, Monica," I said, not looking up from my screen. "Take a week. Reflect on the fact that you almost traded a career you built for a man who didn't even know your favorite color. When you come back, you'll be working in the analytics department. No more client-facing roles for a year. Consider it a period of rehabilitation." She nodded, tears streaming down her face, and left. She was lucky. In the real world, loyalty isn't just a sentiment, it's a currency. She had spent hers, and now she had to earn it back. 6 months later, the dust had finally settled. Jenkins and Associates was no longer just a firm. It was a powerhouse. We had finalized the Sterling merger and our stock was at an all-time high. I was sitting in my new corner office, the one with the view of the lake, when a small, battered envelope arrived. No return address. Inside was a single, handwritten note on cheap lined paper. I'm working at a diner in a small town outside of Reno. I'm washing dishes. I have nothing, just like you said. I hope you're happy. You were always a cold, heartless girl. I guess I really did teach you everything you know. I stared at the cramped, bitter handwriting of a man who still couldn't take responsibility for his own ruin. Even at the bottom of the barrel, he was trying to claim credit for my success. He still thought my strength was a product of his cruelty, rather than a survival mechanism I had to build to escape him. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel pity. I felt a profound sense of peace. I picked up the note, walked over to the shredder, and watched as the paper was turned into confetti. The last tie was severed. The failure had become the architect of her own life, and the man who tried to break her was now just a footnote in a much larger story. I walked to the window and looked out at the city. The sun was setting, casting long, golden shadows over the streets. Down there, thousands of people were fighting their own battles, dealing with their own Richards, and trying to find their way. I picked up my phone and called my assistant. Jenny, cancel my afternoon meetings. I'm going to take the rest of the day off, and send a bouquet of lilies to the reception desk. I want the office to smell like something new is beginning. I walked out of the office, my heels clicking firmly on the marble floor. I wasn't just Sarah Jenkins, the daughter of a failure. I was Sarah Jenkins, the woman who took the anatomy of a betrayal and turned it into a masterpiece of justice. The world thinks revenge is a hot, fiery thing. They think it's about screaming matches and dramatic exits. But they're wrong. Real revenge is cold. Real revenge is logical. It's about building a life so magnificent that the people who tried to destroy you become irrelevant. And as I stepped into the elevator, the doors closing with a soft, expensive hiss, I knew one thing for certain. Accountably isn't just a word. It's a debt that always eventually gets paid in full.